So I just.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, Brad Schaeffer joins me now to make the perhaps provocative, contentious suggestion that although the Third Reich and Hitler was maybe the greater threat to mankind, the war against Japan may have had more long-term impact around the world. His book will be out in 2027. So like when I first had John Parshall on talking about his 1942 book, we have a long wait to wait for it, but it'll be worth waiting. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Brad. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you? Thank you very much for bringing me on. I really appreciate it.
We were just saying before going live, you know, that you've tried to, well, you've successfully reduced the Pacific campaign to a single volume book, which is hard to do because it spreads a lot of area, and we'll get into the enormity of the Pacific campaign. I think we're in a bit of a revolution these days in terms of understanding history, that we're trying to contextualize things more than perhaps we were in the past. Back in the day, people would write a book about the Battle of Coral Sea, or they'd do it about Guadalcanal, or there'd be one about the atomic bombs. But the trend, I think, now is to sort of connect all the dots and make sure that you understand how an event here affects something else over there. And that's what your book does. You know, you juggle the British and Indians in Singapore with what's happening with the Americans on Guadalcanal. You look at the Japanese point of view. So I think you're part of a new trend of bringing it all together. So we await your opinions and argument with bated breath, I think. So I'll bring up your PowerPoint, folks. There's a lot of slides coming your way, so that'll be good for everybody. But please feel free to fire away with questions. But as I said at the top of the show, Brad, your basic claim is it's the Pacific campaign, the Pacific part of the world is the one that in many ways was the most influential. So make your case, sir.
Well, you know, the verdict of history is often decades in the making, right? So I know that I'm not trying to diminish the European theater. It had to be fought. Hitler had to be destroyed. And anybody who fought in that theater should be thanked by literally half of Europe for the freedom that they have today, whether they be American, British, French, Poles flying for the army. I mean, you name it, right? So in no way, shape, or form is this meant to diminish that. What I'm trying to do, though, is elevate the Pacific to where I believe it should be, which is at least an equal place and not a little bit more. And part of the reason for that is I think that because the Pacific tends to get the short shrift of World War II coverage. And I have some slides later that I'll show you what I mean a little bit. Like, for example, if you were in 1944, you were a typical, and by the way, most of my perspective is from the American perspective, because I only know the American attitude towards World War II, which I know often will irk people in other countries. And honestly, I think rightly so, because many Americans kind of have this American-centric attitude that the war, yeah, it started at Pearl Harbor and we were pretty ticked off with the Japanese, but really the war was D-Day to the end of Nazi Germany, and the Americans did it, right? And of course, that's not the case at all. Certainly, the Russians would disagree with that. But when it comes to the Pacific War, I think, you know, if you're in 1944 and you're reading the headlines, you're reading about Americans, you know, marching up, or I should say, Allies marching up the Italian boot. You're reading about, you know, landings on Normandy and the places that they're talking about, because the United States is is really a product of Europe, right? And William Manchester actually made an interesting observation. He said that the American education system taught kids that civilization began at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and marched steadily westward to the west coast of California, right? And that's kind of where it ended. And I think part of the reason why the Pacific hasn't gotten as much attention, or at least, and I'll explain what I mean by that. It actually did after the war for a while, and then it dropped off pretty dramatically, and I'll show you what I mean. But it's because it was such a strange place. Okay, so for instance, if you heard about, you know, American troops, let's say, you know, you're in America. So again, this is American-centric. I'm not dismissing other countries, right? So if you're an American sitting in the United States in 1944, you're hearing about Allied troops, you know, parachuting into Sicily, right? might, if you're Italian American, you might have even had family in Palermo or in Sicily, or you hear about invasion of the continent. You know where France is. You know where London is. Berlin is very familiar to you. All your Paris is very familiar to you. But if you flip over 3 months later and you read the newspaper, it's Allied troops dropped in Nadzeld in New Guinea. Like where the hell is that, right? And if I told you, well, that's near that's near Lae on the Juan Peninsula by the Bismarck Sea, of course, you'd be like, okay, right? And so Americans knew, the Ardennes, they knew, Rome, all this place, but they didn't know like Iora. They didn't, I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing them right myself, and I write about them, right? Sanananda, where the hell was Buna? I know that troops on Iwo Jima were getting letters asking how things are in the South Pacific when it's actually 1,500 miles north of the equator. And so it was such a strange place for the American, for Americans to fight. And I don't think it resonated with the populace the way that the European war did, and I think also part of that has to do with, and there's a racial element to it. Believe it, it's not a woke conversation or anything like that. But the fact of the matter is, at the same time that Americans, the Japanese were so strange to us. They were so alien. I know Eugene Sledge, I think, described when he landed on Peleliu, he saw Japanese markings for the first time, and to him, he said they looked like a chicken had walked on mud and scurried across a piece of parchment. Like that was what Japanese letters were to. Whereas the people in Europe, we use the same alphabet, we have the same Greco-Roman heritage. We speak English, you and I, even though we're from a different continent. And so, but the Japanese were so strange, and they were so alien in everything from the way they dressed to the way they acted to certainly the way they looked, that it's kind of interesting that at the same time that American government was interning 120,000 Japanese Americans, civilians, American citizens, many of them, and they had generals named Eisenhower and Spock.
Just to interrupt you for a second, Brad, people are saying that your sound is a bit muffled. It sounds okay to me.
Is this any better? Is this better?
I'll see what they say. It sounds okay to me. People are saying you're a bit muffled.
Really?
Yeah.
Does this sound?
It's 2 or 3 people have said it. I don't know why. I'm hearing you okay.
Yeah. I mean, I can only tell by if you're hearing me. I can't tell what other people are hearing. Oh crap.
Yeah, they're still saying. Well, no. Yeah, they're saying it's better when you're closer to the microphone.
Okay.
Maybe.
Well, I'm gonna basically. All right. Well, me and the mic are going to be best friends for the next 2 hours then. All right. But I'm not buying the mic dinner when we're done. All right. So. Anyway, so I don't know if they heard or not, but I'll repeat what I said, is that basically the alienness, the strangeness of the Pacific War was, and the enemy in which we fought, was something we'd never fought before. It was the first time we'd actually, I guess other than the Philippine insurrection, was the first time we'd really fought Asians. Since then we fought in Korea, like my dad, we fought in Vietnam, and we're a little bit more familiar with it. So that's what I was saying. At the same time, they were, first of all, can everybody hear me now before I continue?
There's people still saying it's a bit muffled, but I don't understand because it seems okay to me.
All right, hang on. I don't want to. Let's see. I really don't want to have this be an issue.
Yeah, people are saying it's a bit
muffled. That's odd.
People are saying it's not set up correctly. Someone said it's still muffled but better. Other couple are saying it's not very good. Someone says probably isn't proximity to the microphone. It's to do with the device. Have you got the right microphone set up? Is there something?
Yeah, if you can hear me, then I mean this is what I use. Yeah, I'm surprised that others can't.
Yeah, someone's saying it's quite unintelligible. So I don't know. Maybe try dropping out and coming back in again. Sometimes that cures it.
How about this? Is this better? Sorry. Oh, darn it. Hang on.
This is a pain, but we've had this before. We shall persevere.
All right, hang on. That's too bad. I thought we were all set too.
Yeah, I'm okay with it, but people are saying definitely.
Let's see here. All right. Well, here I'm going to plug in. Oh, hang on. I mean, I do this for business all the time. Hang
Yeah, I don't know whether there's something going on.
All right. Hang on. What now?
Try and say again.
Now? Oh gosh.
I've just I cut out echo cancellation. Maybe that was doing something.
All right, wait a minute. This has never been a problem before.
No, they say that's worse.
Hang on. Okay.
Okay.
Now, so let me see here.
That sounds a bit better to me, but I didn't have a point at the beginning. So say something else.
Yeah, testing, 1, 2, test.
Okay.
You hear me fine, right?
I hear you fine. Yeah.
So I don't.
And they can hear me fine. So it's not YouTube. It's something, but I don't know exactly what's going on. It's annoying. It's now they're saying it's getting worse.
All right, hang on. Let's do this. Let me just unplug this completely. Let's just switch to maybe the camera mic. Let me try something else.
Yep, no worries. I'll talk to the audience for a bit. Yeah, they're saying it's muffled for some reason. So, folks, yeah, bear with us. We have these technical issues every now and then. You can't expect it to be perfect here and there. But yeah, for some reason, I'm hearing fine. But
right, yeah. That's what I go by. All right, hang on. All right. I mean, you get. And no one can. This is muffled, huh?
Yeah. They're saying it sounds like it's coming. It's not picking up your actual microphone in front of you. It sounds like it's coming through your laptop or something.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. So let me see here.
Have you got the right microphone selected?
I do. I did.
That's weird.
Okay.
I love it. When a plan comes together, we'll get there.
Well, there's no problem that can't be fixed with an judicious use of high explosives, right? Let's see. All right, now this is my mic again. Let's see, microphone, camera, feedback. I mean, this is what I do all the time. So.
Right, someone said it's getting better now.
All right. Is this okay?
Yeah,
how about this? Is this better? Because I actually took you off this other speaker.
Okay. I mean, it sounds the same to me. I'll wait till I get a bit more feedback from the viewers in the sidebar. If they think it's okay, we'll carry on.
Okay. Sorry about this. I thought we had this all,
Yeah, I thought it was. So someone said it's the correct device, but it sounds like there's a blanket over the mic, so muffled.
Huh.
But then someone else said they can hear every word perfectly. And someone said better. Let's persevere.
How's this sound?
Yeah. Let's persevere and see what people say.
Okay. So anyway, all right, I'll make the point one more time, is that basically the Americans felt that the Japanese were such a strange and alien foe to them. They knew very little about the Far East. They knew very little about who had attacked us. And if you notice, like I said, at the same time that the U.S. government was rounding up, and I'm not judging it, I'm just making a statement, rounding up 120,000 Japanese American citizens, they were giving enormous power to generals with names like Eisenhower and Spaatz and Eichelberger. And in fact, General Walter Kruger, who commanded the 6th Army under MacArthur, spoke with a Plattdeutsch accent even. And of course, when it came to the atomic bomb, you had men with surnames like Oppenheimer, and then and Enrico Fermi from the Italians, and you even had actual Germans like Klaus Fuchs and Lily Hornig, who were and Fuchs actually turned out to be a spy, but he was for the Russians, obviously not for the Japanese. So the level of trust given, and my name is Schaeffer, right? And in fact, at the turn of the 19th century, I believe the 19th into the 20th, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the second language in the United States behind English was German. It wasn't Spanish like today. So we were a very Eurocentric country. So I think that's part of the reason why the Pacific, there were certain parts that captured the imagination, but it's not like Americans were following it on a daily basis as they were because they could say, oh yeah, I've got relatives in France. I've got, my family lives in Poland. I hope they're okay. We were just very connected to that. So, but for me, just to step back a second, just to give your viewers a little bit of an idea of where I come from, I have a personal connection to the Pacific War, and that is because my father was in the 1st Marine Division. He was in Korea. He was a 2nd lieutenant. He was wounded in action, but like we were talking before we got on the air, a lot of the people that served under him in his platoon or served with him were actually veterans of the 1st Marine Division in the previous war. And so I've gotten to meet a few of them before my father passed away. And also, so I've always been kind of interested in that. And so here we'll show you, like, for instance, this was the slide. This is actually my father getting his Purple Heart in Korea. And this was the sticker that I saw on the windshield of my car all the time. And I was like, as a little kid, I was like, what is Guadalcanal? And so that's when I started to research it, right? So really, just before we go into it, I want to just kind of give your viewers what my book attempts to do. This is not a deep dive book the way, this is not like a Shattered Sword, which is, I think the Bible of the Japanese experience in Midway. And I wouldn't even attempt to try and write something like that. But what I do try to do, I'm trying to bring the Pacific War back into the modern focus. Like, we talked about Band of Brothers and all that. There's no reunion for the Pacific, right? There is a reunion for Band of Brothers we were talking about, even though they were companion pieces. And I know Band of Brothers got, I think, much higher viewership than did the Pacific. And I think part of it too, why we're so interested in Europe is it has sort of an aspect of the of the Noble Crusade, right? The men landing in Normandy, marching across the continent, stopping the Germans, liberating concentration camps, and just crushing the Nazis, right? Whereas, we never invaded Japan, really, so we were always fighting on these peripheral places. And the fighting was so vicious and so brutal and so medieval. I think in Europe, you'd have to go to the Eastern Front to see a similar level of brutality, right? So what I'm trying to do is, as my slide says, I'm trying to bring the Pacific War back just to modern attention so that people can understand it. And I'm trying to write a book that, if this is, I want this to be like your first book if you want to learn about the Pacific War, right? This is, a good place to start. So it's more, it's more, I don't want to say superficial, but it's more surface than a deep dive, right? And I do want to, and I will make the argument that I do think it deserves a place with the ETO. And so, and really also another thing is there are a lot of battles that took place in the Pacific that most people have never heard of, but they were really important battles. And the men who fought them, I think, deserve to be remembered. And from my perspective as an American, I also wanted to introduce American readers to the British and Australian experience in the war that they never had. If you're an American and you do know about the Pacific War, you certainly know about Guadalcanal, right? But you don't, there's even a, Guadalcanal Diaries, there's even a band called Guadalcanal Diaries, right? But you don't know about Buna or Gona, right? Or Sanananda. I mean, you might know about Iwo Jima, but you don't know about Biak. And you certainly don't know about the Kokoda Trail or anything like that. And this is just in New Guinea. I'm not even talking about Burma or Malay or anything like that. So I really wanted to do that as well and let Americans know that, hey, yes, we bore the brunt of the Pacific War, but we certainly didn't fight it alone. And I don't even get into the book on China, which obviously is an enormous part of the story as well. Maybe another book I'll do that. So I can only concentrate on certain aspects of it, given the one volume attempt, and I don't want it to be like a book this thick. I want it to be a book this thick you can take to the beach. So that's what I try to do. So I do concentrate on the two mostly U.S. thrusts. Well, the U.S. Australian thrust up New Guinea towards the Philippines, and then the Central Pacific. So basically MacArthur and Nimitz's theaters, right? So let's see here. And within the book, I want to write about the basically three tranches of it. Number one, I'm a novelist. This is my first foray into nonfiction, so I'm always interested in the human stories of it. So I try to bring the war to life to people. I don't just say the Australians fought them back at Yorba Biwa, or I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing these right, so I apologize if I'm not. But I also want to say, and here's what they saw when they were there. Here's what the here's what these Australians, had to go through. Here's what life was like on a daily basis, trying to march through New Guinea up the Owen Stanley Mountains. It was horrific, right? So so you had the strangeness of it, you had the racial aspect of it, and you had the distance of it, and it was being overshadowed by really dramatic events. Certainly in Europe, and the European conflict does deserve that attention. So but when you're in the front lines, like my dad said, he was in the front lines. He didn't know what Matthew Ridgway or whomever in Korea we didn't know what the big plan was. So I do want to take people then to the next tranche, which is the big strategy. How did Nimitz plan on island hopping through the Central Pacific? What different innovations did MacArthur come up with using air power, this new technology, really, when you think about it, right? I mean, when air technology, really, air power just kind of came into its own in the late 30s. And so these generals had to create new styles of warfare that had never really been used before in history. You could read about what Lee did at Chancellorsville or what Napoleon did at Austerlitz, but he didn't have he didn't have aircraft and he didn't have ships. So these were, so it was that. And then, but this is what you were asking me about before, which is the global impact. Yeah. And this is, I guess, where my background as a commodities trader and fund manager comes in, because I try to look at things from the big picture. You have the macroeconomic argument, and then you have, the tiny, which trade do I do? And it's the same with the war. So I asked myself, okay, after the war, what did the world look like? What changes, what upheaval happened after the guns fell silent? And if you really look at it, first of all, Asia has 60% of the world's population, just about. Europe has, I think, 9 or 10%. So you've got a lot of people who were affected by this war. Also, and I'll make the argument again a little bit more detailed later, but if you look at what Europe looked like after the war, right? It didn't really change that much in terms of the countries themselves. A few new countries came about, but really what you had too was for half of the continent, you replaced one totalitarian with another. You just, great, and the Nazi, there was an old joke in Germany, right, that said optimists are learning English, pessimists are learning Russian, right? So you had that, right? But again, the fact that the Allies did land in Normandy and push east, definitely is why, Western Europe itself, they saved Western Europe not just from Germany, but from communism as well, and totalitarianism. So that had to be fought. But if you look at what the Pacific War did, all right, I mean, it shattered empires, some of which had been there for 300 years. Like the Dutch had been in Asia for 300 years. I believe, and don't hold me to this, but I believe Singapore was a British colony since 1819. And within a matter of like 6 months, and the Americans had the Philippines, we had Guam and Wake Island and all that. And in a matter of like 6 months to a year, that was all shattered, right? You had Percival surrendering 75,000 or whatever the number was British troops to Yamashita in Singapore. You had King and Wainwright surrendering, tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops to Hama. These were the two largest capitulations in either country's history, right? You had the Dutch surrendering the Dutch East Indies. Obviously, the French had already lost Indochina after they were de facto in charge of Indochina, but after 41, it was a Japanese satrapy basically. And once the Japanese left, you had this what do you want to call it, like a vacuum, right? And there was no way that these Asian countries, having seen their white, by the way, I don't obsess on race on this story, right? So I don't want people to think that, but there was no way that these Asian countries were going to then, there's no way Indochina was going to go after this. Okay, let's go back to be under the French again, or Malaya saying, yeah, we know that these Asian Japanese destroyed our British protectors in 2 months, but let's go back to the way things were. That was not going to happen. So what you saw coming out of the Pacific War, and it took decades for its repercussions to really hit. You saw just these independence movements that really created the modern world that we know. And in 2012, Asia became became a larger economy than the EU, if memory serves. Again, by the way, anything I say, any claim I make to anybody listening, if you have different information or you think that I'm off, by all means tell me. my loyalty is to the history. It's not to my ego. I'd rather be proven wrong than make a statement that goes into print. The good part about one of the reasons I want to go on this early is because this is my first foray into this type of a book. So I didn't want to put everything out in print and then discover later that I made a mistake. Right? So, like, I'll give you an example, right? You had I forget who the guest was, but he made an interesting point that the Doolittle raid, and I've already fixed that in my book, that the Doolittle raid did not necessarily cause the Japanese Navy to then want to expand. That they'd already planned it before the raid. They'd got the Army on board, right? So there's a little bit of a myth that I just always thought was true, right? And now so your show is very helpful in that respect to us, right? So. I think the global impact, the economic impact, the second most powerful nation in the world now is China. And there's a reason, and that's a direct result of the fact that the Japanese had weakened the nationalists so much that the communists were able to drive them off to Formosa in 1949. So all these repercussions, they took time to manifest. But really the 21st century, I think, is more the world that the Pacific War made. Certainly for half of it, that's why I call it a war for half the world. It's not it's not geographic. It's not technically half the world. There's anything from, depending on the boundaries, you use anything from 1/5 to 2/5. That's still an enormous battlefield. So I think that's why I like to think that the war certainly, I think, had the longer global impact, not for Europe, but certainly for, when you think about it, my father got wounded in Korea. He didn't get wounded in Czechoslovakia, right? And we had family fighting. I think they were in Vietnam. We had people, in the United States. We've got 57,000 dead from 58,000 from Vietnam. So the war continued in a way, even after it created. The Asian Liberty Bells began declining afterwards, and I think that was a really important point. It destroyed colonialism, and it was interesting. The historian Neil Ferguson, one of my favorites, he actually said that Asia did not come into its own after the Pacific War. It reclaimed its place of prominence after the Atlantic Age, is the way he said it, so beautifully. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So that's kind of my point on that. So let's see here. So again, there's three aspects of the book. There's the human aspect, right? You can see I care about what were the guys in the field thinking. This is the Eugene sledge, with the old breed level of it, right? Then you have the strategic level, right? This is the people who write books about like King and MacArthur and whatnot. And then here's what I was talking about, the geopolitical. Here's this one example. China was not, remember, when I was a kid, it used to be even John Lennon wrote a song, "They're starving back in China, so finish what you got," right? So Chinese, when I was a kid, it was always like, eat your food, they're starving in China, right? That's what I always heard from my parents. Now, my father ended up fighting them. So anyway, so I think this graph here kind of shows one aspect of it. So let's see here. But here's where, so this kind of gets into why I think the Pacific wasn't as well known to Americans. And this comes from Daniel Immerwahr's wonderful book called How to Hide an Empire. If people haven't read it, I highly recommend this book. I heard about it on a lark and I read it. It's one of the best books I've read about the American experience in the 20th century. And it really looks at it from a different angle. So if you take a look, right, in 1930, even the Philippines had 18 million people and they were U.S. nationals. We basically annexed it after the Spanish-American War, right around the turn of the century. For every story the New York Times ran about the Philippines, which had more American nationals than New York, it ran 2 on Poland, of all things, right? And that same year in 1930, it had 7 stories about Hawaii, 0 about Guam, yet in 1 month, it ran 11 stories on the Soviet Union, right? So most Americans didn't know that 10% of our population lived outside the contiguous United States in this Asian perimeter that we had more or less either inherited or taken over after we defeated the Spanish. So this war goes way back, right? And so if you take a look here, and this was an interesting stat I looked at. Because I remember, like most of the movies that I know about the Pacific are like The Sands of Iwo Jima, They Were Expendable, Go for Broke, all these movies, and they were made right after the war or during the war, right? So if you take a look here, I ran this is a bit of an informal search, but you're using the parameters I have. If you take a look, in the 1940s, there were more movies about the Pacific than Europe. In the 1950s, there were more, but then from 1970 onward, you can see Europe takes over dramatically. And I think I'm living, I'm old enough to remember those older movies, but the generation today grew up with the Saving Private Ryan type of movies. I grew up with the Band of Brothers, and I think that they know a lot more about that. And I think the reason is because America had become exhausted by Asia after fighting Korea, Vietnam. After the being. So I think there was a cultural reason why Europe became the focal point of so many movies. Also, more of an understanding and more of the Holocaust brought that more into. So you really see in American culture, the Pacific starts to really take a back seat, to the point now where I don't think many people are really aware of what took place in that in the war, and that's really a shame. So my goal is to throw it back in front of you and go, hey, look, this war took place too, and there was a lot of what going on all over the place, right? And so this is basically, this is from Guadalcanal. This is, imagine you're an American farm boy. Next thing you know it, you're here, on the Solomons, right? So it looked distant. It was strange. It was hard to follow. What was the difference between New Ireland, New Britain, New Hebrides? What was Guam versus Tinian? I've got family on Palau, so where the hell was Peleliu, right? Well, Peleliu, was a place that mattered a lot to the guys who fought there. So again, you can see here, at the same time that we're giving Americans with German ancestry the keys to the kingdom, we're taking Japanese Americans, who are probably, as Studs Terkel said, probably the most law-abiding of any American citizens. And we're throwing them in concentration camps for the sole reason that their name was Nakajima as opposed to Schaeffer, or as opposed to like my wife, Farako. And that's, and I don't, so I think that has something to do with it. So you can't ignore the racial aspect of it. And I think, and however, what I make it a point in my book to say is that if you want to see racism just as vicious, if not more so, check out the Japanese side of things, right? And I know that George Orwell said that Japanese racial ideas of supremacy were even more severe than the Germans. And I think Max Hastings said only the SS showed as much viciousness towards civilian populations as did the Japanese, and they justified it with racial supremacy, the Yamato race. So you've got two races, right, who've never really been in contact. Japan didn't open up until 1853, as you know, right? I mean, they had two centuries of complete isolation. Perry basically said, your brains or your signature's going on this contract, right? And even though MacArthur tried to make it sound like it was more of a favor to them, but so you have that aspect of it, and you've got strange place, strange people, vicious, brutal fighting, and it was also episodic, right? It wasn't like what's going on the Western Front today. Oh, our boys took Foy, or it was like, okay, we took Saipan, we took Tinian, we took Guam. Okay, that's June, July. All right. Now you have to wait till October to land on Leyte, right? And you got to wait, then you got to wait till January to land on Luzon. And so you have these episodic battles. I just think it was harder for people to follow, and it was so big, it was so broad. It was certainly the largest conflict zone in history if you take the water and the land and everything. And it's what Charles Willoughby called a war of distances.
Mm. And if you were a journalist, for example, a war correspondent in 1944 in Europe, if you were based, for example, in Paris after liberation, you were kind of less than 200 miles from every campaign that was going on to some extent.
Exactly.
Was where the hell do you base yourself in the Pacific to be?
That's a great point. See, there you go. That's a point I never even thought about. That's an excellent point.
Wherever you are, you're thousands of miles away from most of it. If you happen to be on Tinian in 1945, sure, you've got Tinian and Guam on your doorstep, but Burma's a long way away. China's a long way away. Okinawa's a long way away. So, I think it was easier to report on that on the ETO as well.
Absolutely. It was easier to report on it, and you also had a more, news is a business, and you had a more receptive audience. People are, okay, great. That's really interesting that we took Ulithi, wherever the hell that is. But so, what are our boys marching in Rome yet? Something like that. And so, like, if you look at the distances, one of the points I make is if you're flying a 5th Air Force B-24 out of Port Moresby, that's the final terminus of an 8,300 mile supply line that begins in a plant in Willow Run, Michigan.
Yeah.
And it's if you take a, I don't want to, I'm going to stick to my little thing here. I could go off. I like stream of consciousness thinking, so keep me my rails here. So let's see here. So again, I talked about this before. There's a Eurocentric education too, which had a lot to do with it. And if you take a look here, I've superimposed the United States on the Pacific Ocean, just to give people an idea of the size of this battlefield.
Yeah.
And I think it was. I've written down a couple stats here. It was, you call it 75 million square miles all in. If you consider Japanese submarines surfacing off the coast of Chile and whatnot, and you've got those 280 times the size of Texas and 19 times even the size of Europe. So this was just, but it was mostly water, right? But this was just a massive battlefield. Something that I'm actually surprised people don't talk more about. I think just from a storyteller standpoint, it's a freaking cool story. You've got this, you just got this, okay, let's fight for the largest ocean in the world. And that was really the whole battlefield, right? So anyway, the book starts, so my point, I guess, to close out what you were asking before, and I'll revisit it again, is that I think we're living economically and in terms of geopolitically in more, not solely, but more perhaps, in the world that the Pacific War left behind. Just because, and I'll show you some graphs later that illustrate the point. But I love this. This is, you can see, the thing too that fascinates me about this war, and I want Americans, I keep saying Americans just because that's what I'm talking about, right? You guys, I have a feeling Europeans know more about this. But is that Japan was not a power for most of our national existence. 1853, this famous woodblock, drawing. It's actually in color, but I just keep everything black and white. That shows, it shows Matthew Perry's black ships suddenly showing up in Edo Harbor in 1853. And this was the first time they'd seen really foreigners other than the tiny island off of Nagasaki, which they allowed to come in once a year, a trade or something like that. So these Japanese, what fascinates me about them is the lead up to this story is interesting too, because they went from literally, fighting with swords and wooden boats to, by the turn of the century, blasting the Russian Navy out of Tsushima, right? And Port Arthur. And that's an incredible metamorphosis in an incredibly short period of time. I don't think, to my knowledge, no nation has so industrialized, so changed its makeup so quickly or so aggressively as did Japan. And I think that actually speaks to their culture of adoption pretty well. So you've got all of a sudden this country that Americans never heard of before, really for the most part, most other than this exotic land in the East. Suddenly you've got Japan becoming a modern power in a very quick time. And all of a sudden you've got these two modern powers who, at the same time, aircraft are being developed, right? So now you want sea bases and seaplanes and all that. So you just see these two countries slowly on a collision course. It's like the Pacific War was really almost 90 years in the making. It really, if you think about Perry's first visit in 1853, and then FDR brokering the Treaty of Portsmouth between. But so you have between that and all of a sudden, this world power, Russia, gets beat by the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. And of course, the Japanese are like, okay, great. Now, well, if these guys can have an empire, why can't we? And that was sort of their mentality. So you start to see this collision course happen, and I think it's really interesting to follow it and to see the different decisions that were made and so at one point, so Japan starts to realize that they don't have the natural resources to sustain their empire, right? They get 90% of their oil from the United States, for example, or 80%. I don't know the exact number, right? So they begin to develop these two different strategies, right? They have this northern plan and they have this southern plan, as we know. Well, the northern plan, and the reason why I'm interested in the Eastern Front of World War II, and why I think it actually connects to the Pacific War beyond Russia's invasion of Manchuria, is if you take a look in 1908, Japan, Japan sought empire, but in July 1939, once the Japanese had taken Manchuria, all of a sudden the Japanese and the Russians have this common border along with Mongolia, right? And so they have this series of border wars. Some of them are enormous border wars. I mean, some of them are enormous wars. And I say in the book that just because there's not a lot of not a lot of people know about these battles, it doesn't mean they weren't important or they didn't matter tremendously. And I think, like for instance, Khalkhin Gol mattered an awful lot. And the reason is because it forced the Japanese to realize that, okay, the Russians, this guy Zhukov, obviously one of the great generals of the war, these Russians have beaten us. We've killed more of them. You know, I mean, the Russians know how to do one thing, is to take a lot of casualties and keep going, right? And they're like, there's no way we can fight a war of attrition with them. So forget about cutting off the Trans-Siberian. Forget about taking their territory. And the Russians are like, you're not going to cut off the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So they, Stalin stopped them. And what's important is that when the Japanese sued for peace, or when they had peace, I should say, they both sides did, that freed Japan to bring troops into Indochina, right? And it also gave Stalin a little bit less of a pressure point on his eastern flank, and that gave him the wherewithal to then join Hitler and invade Poland. I believe it was 17 days, or somebody can tell me if I'm wrong, however long it was after the Germans invaded. And now suddenly Germany and Russia have a common border. Poland doesn't exist anymore. So because of this battle in the Far East, it changed, it got Japan it forced Japan to think, okay, well, we got to go southwest. We can't go, or we got to go southeast. So we got to go into Southeast Asia, and we got to do this because that's where the oil is, and that's where, and we are really vulnerable, and we can't beat the Russians. So again, this is where, like, you talk about, like, the verdict of history, and I like to look at things a little bit like this. Battle of Khalkhin Gol was an enormous battle, and it also showed the Japanese didn't really like to surrender very much, which was interesting. One of their movements was wiped out because they refused to surrender, and it really kind of set the stage to allow Russia's, machinations in the Eastern Front, the Poland and whatnot. And then you had it allowed the Japanese to start moving into Indochina, which put them into a collision course with us, and that's when we did our first round of economic sanctions on them, right? So this had an effect, right? So anyway, so here's the guys. I'm sure everybody watching this knows who these people are. I don't need to dwell on them, right? But I just like to visualize things. I always wondered what all these medals were too, but that's something else. So there's Yamamoto, and there's Ugaki, one of the most interesting characters in the war. Actually, this guy kind of showed up everywhere and survived. He was in the other plane that was shot down when Yamamoto was shot down. He survived, right? This guy commanded the Yamato. He was commanded war games in Midway. That was interesting. So, and here's the American side. Now, King has become one of my favorite. Has become one of my favorite characters of the war. I think he's one of the guys who brought the Pacific War into the forefront. And you had an author on recently who did a deep dive into King, and I thought that was fascinating. And you talked about his Anglophobia and all that, or was he really Anglophobic, and how he handled the combined.
I think King is going through a bit of reevaluation in the last few years. I mean, we had Trent Hone talking about him, we had Brian Walters talking about him. I think for me as a Brit, he's had this, he hates the Brits, even though his mum and I think maybe both of his parents are British. But King is, we talk about Marshall a lot, but King seems to be relegated to almost like a joke figure because of his alleged hatred of the Brits. And that statement he made of, the Germany first thing, that is, I know you unpack that in your book, which is, I feel that too much emphasis on that one statement is misplaced. We know what it means by it, but it's a sound bite. It's not. I'm not saying it's not meant to be taken seriously, but it's like there's a lot more depth to it than just Germany first, because that's not really what he means, is it? I mean, it's sort of what he means, but Well,
what's interesting, Paul, is that when I first started writing this, I was one of my arguments was going to be that we should not have prioritized Europe so much more than the Pacific and the way you look at it is you look at tonnage shipped and all that. But really, when I started looking at the numbers, we actually, if you take here, in fact, I'll show. I think I have a slide that explains this with it. Okay, just bear with me 1 second. There's actually, okay, here's a slide. I'm just going to go real quick. Okay, so if you take a look, okay, actually, I don't have it on this, but if you look at just Army, I thought I had it on another slide, but if you just looked at the Army alone, it looked like we were sending a lot more materiel to Europe than Great Britain, or than to Europe than Japan, right? But if you combine Army and Navy, right, and the Pacific was primarily as much a naval battle as anything, right? All of a sudden, if you take a look at the tonnage shift in 1944, it's pretty similar. And in fact, in 1942, and I thought I had the slide up. I thought I'd give it, but it doesn't matter. In 1942, we actually shipped more to the Pacific at first than we did to Europe, from what I understand. And I think a lot of that has to do with King, and King basically saying, and the reason is, and let me go back to this. There we go. 1 second. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about this, guys.
That's all good.
While I have you, can everybody hear me again?
Yeah, no one said anything. Okay. It's all much better now.
Okay, well, this is actually, I thought I sent you a different slide presentation. Is my bad. But anyway, if you, I forget where I was going with this. But anyway, so King, I think, realized early on, oh yeah, there's a report, and I thought I had it. I'll find it for you. But they did a summary report in 1945. It came out July 1st, and I might have it on here somewhere. I thought I had it. Anyway, it said that, it talks about the Europe first policy. Now, it sort of does a forensic analysis of the war afterwards. And it said that, as you know, the idea was Europe first, like you said, and that was really a soundbite. And I think it could have been part to placate Churchill a little bit, but Europe first. So we're going to defeat Nazi Germany. We're going to hold Japan at bay, and then we're going to, turn on Japan and give them the 1-2 punch and get them out of the, and finally end these guys. The problem is that the Japanese didn't read that, right? The Japanese didn't know that they were just supposed to be kept at bay, right? So all of a sudden, hang on 1 second, Paul. This is the land of glitches, because this isn't what I thought I sent you, but it's fine.
This is the one you uploaded. This is your.
No, the one I uploaded. Yeah, okay. It's one of those. I'm dealing with something. I'll tell you later. All right. So the problem is that the Japanese didn't get the memo, right? When right before the war started, the American planners were saying, okay, if the Japanese attack, where are they going to hit us? Well, they could hit us at Pearl Harbor, and that's pretty far. They probably wouldn't do that. That'd be crazy, right? But we're in the Philippines. That's probably the most likely place, because the Philippines sits like a dagger aimed right at the Japanese supply lines between the home islands and the East Indies, so their resources and their assets. So that makes sense. They might try to hit us at Wake, maybe Guam. They might try to take Malaya. They can't take Singapore. That's the Gibraltar of the East. So well, whatever. We'll see what they do. What we didn't know is they're going to hit all of them at once. If the Germans created blitzkrieg, the Japanese certainly perfected it, because they had an element to it that the Germans didn't have, which was naval power. I mean, the Kriegsmarine was 1/10 the size of the Royal Navy. Most of it eventually was steered towards U-boats almost completely, after the surface raiders turned out to be a very expensive white elephants for them. But there was not coordination, really. It wasn't like von Bach is talking to Admiral Rader at the time and whatnot. Whereas the Japanese were, even though the forces hated each other, they certainly needed each other, because the IJA could not invade these places without the Navy. And so the Japanese hit every place at once. So all of a sudden, you've got Americans, taken prisoner in Guam, taken prisoner on Wake Island. You've got them fighting for their lives in Bataan. You've got the Japanese, moving on to Tulagi. I mean, the Japanese just kept moving. So the report actually said the Europe first, the assessments that they had made before the war were very unrealistic. So I think what King did was he said, hey, these guys are as much of a threat as anybody else. In fact, more so, I think, because as he said, they're the guys who actually attacked us. And so he was able to, I think, muscle a lot of more materiel towards the Navy than I think a person with less of his backbone, to put it nicely, would have done. Look, he needed a son of a bitch, right? And he was the son of a bitch, right? He was the Navy son of a bitch, and it's a good thing he was, right? So that's why he started creating these these different bases, New Caledonia, and all these, to try and basically stop the Japanese. And then what he just needed was that catalytic moment that they finally had their first real defeat, and it came obviously in Midway. But so you can see here, while the Japanese are on the move. Okay, so what's going on in Europe at the time, right? Europe first, right? We got to help them. Hitler's going to crush it. He's going to invade the world. He's going to be on, he's going to be on American shores any day now. We will all be speaking German. Well, no. In fact, as we were talking about Jonathan Dimbleby's book before the war, or before our conversation, he makes it, I think, a pretty compelling argument that the war in Europe, although it was not won in 1941, it was lost by Germany in 1941 when Barbarossa did not succeed in its objectives. Now, there were plenty of victories afterwards, right? But he argues, and I agree with him, that they were ephemeral victories. That really, 8 out of 10 Wehrmacht were killed by the Red Army, and that really it was the Red Army that destroyed the Germans. And so I don't think, and between that and I don't think Sea Line was ever a realistic possibility. I mean, you saw how hard it took for us to cross 26 miles of channel, right? So how were the Germans going to do it, especially when many of their boats were shallow draft for rivers? They weren't even invasion barges, right? And Churchill would not have hesitated to use poison gas if it was between that and seeing the Nazi flag flying in Piccadilly, right? So I don't think that was realistic at all. So I think Americans have this idea today that that Hitler was on. I remember, for example, I was watching. You were talking about the culture aspect, right? I remember if you watch the movie Bridge Too Far, it says she's talking about 1944, and she said the war is still going Hitler's way, is what she said. Is what they said in the opening voiceover. No, the war was not going Hitler's way at all. It was basically, it was over by then. The Russians were already in. The Russians had pushed them out, right? The Americans had already landed on the continent. No, the war was not going Hitler's way at all. He'd been kicked out of North Africa. He'd lost Rome, and if anything, he was going to. So again, we Americans have this idea that that but for D-Day, Hitler would have won the whole thing, right? I don't think that's the case. But the interesting thing is that neither did the planners at the time, despite their rhetoric, like you talked about, despite their use of this term, right? Europe first. Their actions spoke otherwise, certainly in terms of tonnage and whatnot. So, obviously, Japan has to. I don't know if you've ever talked about Pearl Harbor before on this show.
Just about 15 times.
Have you ever heard about this thing? So, did you hear about where Fuchida wanted to do the third strike, and it was a brilliant, it was a masterful, from start to finish. And, so the Japanese, obviously, this is Yamamoto's obsession. He wants to. His idea is to cripple the U.S. fleet, obviously, and the story behind it. But of course, what we also know is that the carriers weren't there, and that really what Pearl Harbor did was two things, actually three things. One was it destroyed beyond repair 3 old U.S. battleships, and it damaged 5 others that were resurrected and sent back into the action pretty quickly. Right, the Maryland was shelling Tarawa by 1943, for example, by November. What it didn't, I think the Japanese thought that they were going to have another Tsushima or whatever, a surprise attack on the fleet. That'll get the Russians to the bargaining table, whatever. Same thing's going to happen to the Americans. There's this idea that Yamamoto was this, respected America. That screenwriter's line about sleeping giant. But if you look at Yamamoto, he didn't respect American culture. He respected our industry, but he thought we were soft. They were, like Victor Davis Hanson says, they wore spats and they drove cars, and they're very good at. I think didn't Goring even say they're good at making refrigerators, not fighter planes. And what that did was that took a divided nation and it completely galvanized us in a way that I don't think Americans today could ever understand. I guess the closest would be 9/11. But imagine if this was an actual country, as opposed to just this nebulous group of terrorists or what have you. So it really galvanized the United States, and it backfired on Japan enormously. It was as big a mistake for them as Barbarossa was for Germany, I believe. So, and it also really fostered the hatred between these two countries. if you look at propaganda, and I didn't put it up here because it's kind of insulting, but if you look at propaganda, the Japanese were featured as like, the Germans were like these cold, like Dr. Evil types, with the monocle and the unfeeling, whatever, kind of like my family. but the Japanese were this blinky-eyed, toothy Gilbert and Sullivan race. They were monkeys, they were whatever, and of course the Americans were hairy barbarians. So this racial aspect of this war really, really heated up very quickly, and it was a sneak attack too, which was but as we know, it wasn't intended to be. There's more to it than that. Is that a lot of it had to do with just poor translation of these directives coming from Tokyo, and they didn't get it out to them in time before the planes started dropping their bombs, right? So I just like this photograph because this shows the actual moment when a torpedo hits the West Virginia and Oklahoma. This is kind of cool. You can see a little Val actually flying right here. You can see the seaplane hangars already on fire. Yep. You can see this is the Utah and the Raleigh, and they're already listing the ports. So this is actually a really cool photograph. So I just thought I'd throw that in there just for the hell of it, right? So there's your Japanese blitzkrieg, right? Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines. I mean, these guys seem unstoppable, and guys like King were like, "Look, let's not underestimate these guys." When they sank the repulsive Prince of Wales just 3 days into the war, there was an interview with a British captain in Malaya fighting, and he said, "We couldn't believe it." He said, "But one quickly realized they were against a first-class power." For his time. So. I mean, and I think, again, part of the reason why we thought we could just contain the Japanese is we didn't take them seriously. Even MacArthur, who became probably the guy who respected them the most for what they could do, even he, when he first saw Japanese planes flying over Luzon at the beginning of the war, he just assumed they were white pilots, right? Yeah. So I think we got ourselves caught flat-footed, and I think that's why, if you take a look at 1942, and I'd love to hear John Parshall's take on this, since he wrote that. And that book on it. It looked like we may have been talking Europe first, but we were acting as if almost Japan was the bigger threat. And if you look at statistics, if you look at the polling certainly showed that more Americans felt the Japanese were the enemy, right? And King did too. King said, why we should attack the people who attacked us. And I think also King believed that, in his words, he didn't want Great Britain fighting its colonial war to the last American, was the view. And the interesting thing too, though, is, and again, you guys know this, is that in 1942, Marshall, who was a great administrator, but I'm very glad he didn't have any strategic control, because he wanted to invade Europe in 1942 across the Channel, and you guys who already fought the Germans for 2 years were like, that's not going to happen. You guys, why don't you just trust us? And I guess that's what the up is about, kind of drive home the point. So,
just before you go, if you go back to that photo with the bicycles, I think even that photo you chose with the bicycles there, in that the way those were kind of reported at the time is, look at the Japanese, they're having to cycle to battle. And yet, actually, what they were demonstrating was a really good combined arms. They were able to have infantry on cycles, keeping up with the infantry support tanks that could move and sweep down through Malaya, etc., etc. Yet at the same time, the newspapers are putting pictures of Panzer IIs and Panzer Is in the Blitzkrieg, saying, "Look, the Germans are doing this incredible lightning war. Ooh, aren't they scary?" But the Japanese, even though they're winning at this point, somehow the West are trying to portray them comically. Forget, and that's separate from the racial aspect. That's just like, oh look, they're on bicycles. There's a constant underestimation. Yeah,
I mean, their use of bicycles, which basically almost became symbolic of the Malaya campaign. This picture is actually, I believe, from the Dutch East Indies, but it's the same concept.
Yeah.
You talk about, right. So the Germans, the Germans had this note. Everybody thought of the Germans as this mechanized machine, right? But it took 600. 80% of the German army was still horse-drawn. Right? Yeah. 600. They had 600,000 draft horses go with them into Russia, and since most of them, other than these shock panzer units, most of the Lancers had to walk on foot, and they really didn't make any more. They didn't really move any faster than Napoleon's army did. You had these panzers that went ahead, and they had to hold these pockets in place until the infantry could come in with the artillery and reduce them. But again, Americans think of the Germans as the these mechanisms, and they think they had these great equipment. I mean, the Panzer, I guess, the main battle tank in 1941 was the Mark III Panzer. The Mark IV had the short barrel gun for the, for infantry support. Now they put that long 75 millimeter on it, or whatever it was, 76 later. But so Americans, we all think of them as this German super juggernaut of armored vehicles. Well, actually, the French Char B tank was probably better than the Mark III. And of course, once they saw the T-34, I mean, forget it. They're firing their guns into these things. They're just pinging off the sloped armor, right? So again, I think part of it was we underestimated the Japanese, we overestimated the Germans. King didn't, and that's why I like King a lot, right?
Yeah, fair point.
So yeah, this is very, also another thing too is that, we look at these little Japanese tanks, right? Like the Hago, not these little Hago tanks. They look like almost toy tanks. They almost look like you could wind them up, right? And send them on their way. They got the little 37 millimeter gun or whatever it is. But where they were fighting, and especially in Malaya, right? I mean, this is all jungle, right? So you've got very few tracks, right? So you couldn't move a Tiger tank through this stuff, right? You want these little tiny tanks, and they're there for infantry support. They're not going to be fighting against other tanks, right? And so they're there, exactly. and between that and you get the bicycles. While Percival's men are slogging their way through the jungle, the bicycles are riding down these little side trails, and if their tires pop, they just rode the bare rims. If there was an obstruction, you just carried them over. It was quite ingenious, actually, and it showed some real outside the box thinking. And I think the Allies in the beginning of the war paid heavily for not estimating the Japanese as well as they should have, right? So here you go. Here's what happens, right? Singapore and Bataan. Here's the famous photographs of Percival, and there's Yamashita basically bluffing his way, right? I mean, he was running out of ammo at this point, and he had even confided that if Percival had launched any real strenuous counterattacks, it might have pushed him away at Slim River or whatnot. And so at the very end, when he's sitting here, he's saying, Percival's like, you said through his interpreter, are you going to surrender? And Percival was like, well, can we have some more time? And so he made up something about, no, we're going to launch a night attack tonight. It's going to be all over. So Yamashita finally said in broken English, is the British Army surrendering, yes or no, right? So he basically bluffed his way. So not only were they great soldiers, they had good equipment, especially for the campaigns in which they were fighting. They also had some pretty some good generals. At least Yamashita was, right? Hama not so much, but Yamashita, right? So here comes the Americans, right? And here's MacArthur's. I'm actually pretty kind to MacArthur in the book. I happen to like MacArthur, and I will tell you why. I have a personal reason. My father loved MacArthur because he was in the 1st Marines, and when they landed at Incheon, even though MacArthur was an Army brat, he chose his division, right? So I said, the guy must know something. The guy must know something about who the best are. Marines. Right? So anyway, but so MacArthur makes several mistakes here, as we know. Number one is that he expects the Japanese not to attack right away. He didn't think they'd attack till the first week or so of 1942. Meanwhile, December 8th, at 5:30 in the morning, he's already hearing about Pearl Harbor, right? And by 9 hours later, he loses his entire Air Force on the ground 9 hours, or at least in Luzon, half of the Philippine Air Force, 9 hours after Pearl Harbor. And then, and it's interesting, they think that he might have had a nervous breakdown at that time. That, it happens, right? Stonewall Jackson had a nervous breakdown at White Plains, and he was incapable of comprehending what was happening. And then he made another mistake, which was he abandoned War Plan Orange, which was basically stock Bataan with as much as you can, hunker down and wait for relief, right? MacArthur's like, no, we're going to stop them at the beaches. Well, his Filipino troops were no match for Chinese veterans. Really, the core, his undertrained Filipino troops, the Filipinos that actually fought on Bataan, fought fantastically, alongside the Americans. And that's another thing I want Americans to know too, is that, it wasn't Americans primarily who surrendered to Bataan, it was Filipinos. And these guys fought really, really well in this battle. Even the Japanese even grudgingly admitted it. So MacArthur made another mistake, which was he stubbornly adhered to his defense on the beach strategy. And meantime, what he should have been doing was just taking every truck loaded with all the rice and food he could have and just jammed it in Bataan. If you look here at Cabanatuan, for example, there was enough rice here to last a long siege. And meanwhile, a lot of the trucks moving into Bataan were empty. So MacArthur made two really, really bad mistakes. One was letting his Air Force be destroyed, and two was not adequately providing for a long siege. So, and I think that's where a lot of the MacArthur haters, come from. They're like, and they're right. He botched it. However, he also recovered his senses very quickly, and he did something very difficult, which was a double retrograde retreat. So if you take a look here, these are all these defense lines that he had set up for Wainwright, because MacArthur knew the terrain and Hama didn't. Each one of these was a prime defense line. So this defense in depth that MacArthur had laid out after he finally adopted WPO was pretty ingenious. And on top of that, he was able to pull his troops out through Manila, and he did a double retrograde retreat, which is the most difficult military maneuver to do, because you've got to hold them off just enough so that the rest of your troops can get up, but you can't stay there too long or else you'll be outflanked yourself. And it takes exquisite timing. And and he did that to the point where even John Pershing described it as one of the greatest maneuvers he'd ever seen. So he recovered, right? But by now he's stuck in Bataan. And this is where the Europe First mythology kind of kicks in a little bit. And this is where actually my research took my original, the worst thing you can do is have a thesis and then search for evidence to try to back it up, right? What's that, confirmation bias, is that the term? I forget what it is. So let's say I said, at the very beginning, my theory was that, or my assumption was that these guys on Bataan fighting it out with the Japanese, and one of the great defenses in military history, to be honest. I mean, these guys really, really fought well, and they fought on 2,000 calories a day, then 1,000 calories a day. Go 1,000 calories a day a couple of days. See how much energy you have to watch TV, let alone fight the Japanese in the steaming jungles of the Philippines while you're suffering from malaria and you've got leeches all over you. I mean, it was horrible, right? And so MacArthur, he pulls his troops back, right? They blow the bridge, the Columbus Bridge, right, on January 1st, 42. So they're here. So now he settles in for a long siege. So MacArthur begins writing these letters and these communiques to, saying, come on, okay, we're here. Relieve us, bring your troops. You're sending all these guys to Europe, and they're getting sunk by the Germans right and left, right offshore, because they had, I think the second happy time, whatever the Germans called it, right? And meanwhile, nothing is coming to the Philippines. So MacArthur begins to think that the Philippines are being abandoned. And he's right in the sense that no real relief was going to come to him, but where was it going to go once they captured Manila? Right now, remember this. My original thesis was they were abandoned. They should have been relieved instead of going to Europe. That was going to be my thesis, right? But I'm like, actually, once Hama took Manila Bay and Cavite, okay, where are you going to land? You're here, I guess Mariveles, because you control Corregidor, but you're not going to have like troops. But there's the IJNs all around here, and they're at the height of their power, right? And we don't even have it. We've lost our surface fleet for the most part. It's off the game board for a little bit. We've got, I think, 3 carriers at the time in the whole Pacific. You were bringing the Wasp over, but you've got Saratoga, and which, as we saw, Fletcher didn't want to lose to relieve weight. So he becomes very embittered. And it's not just that, but the reason I'm bringing it up is that Quezon, the Philippine president, also begins to think that the Americans are abandoning him. And he's like, we've been loyal to you, and in return, you're abandoning us. And Quezon had a famous statement. When he's noticing all the convoys going to Europe, going to Great Britain, and he said, how typical of America to writhe in agony over a distant cousin while a daughter is being raped in the back room, is the line that he used, right? So he actually petitioned Roosevelt through, with the hesitant support of his cabinet, to declare Philippine independence. He said to Carlos Romulo, one of his a journalist who became a aide-de-camp to MacArthur. He said, our country is being destroyed. This isn't our fight, right? It was not, Roosevelt denied him, but it was, again, what they call the first clang of the Asian Liberty Bell. So you're starting to see things start to change as well, right? I will say this, that I don't think they could have been relieved, but I do think that there was a conscientious effort on the part of Washington to keep making them think they were going to be, to keep them fighting. Because as early as Stimson, the American Secretary of was he State or War? I'm sure it's on my notes somewhere, but he actually said to Churchill, there are times when men have to die, and that was in December. So they had no intention of relieving the Philippines, but they kept sending Marshall and Stimson and FDR were sending these communiques saying, hang on, basically intimating, although never actually saying that help is on the way, never giving a timeline or anything like that, but saying your stand is thrilling the nation. Look forward to I think one of them said, look forward to the relief of your nation. He said to Quezon, but he didn't say when, right? So finally, they decide that they got to get MacArthur out of there. And MacArthur thinks, okay, well, they're pulling me out because I've been ordered. So, but MacArthur would have disobeyed those orders if he didn't think he was being pulled out to then to basically land in Australia, be greeted by this American army that's being formed, to then Australia-American army, to then come back to the Philippines. Basically, because when he said to Wainwright, he said, I've got to get through, to Australia. Wainwright said to him as he turned over command to Jonathan Wainwright, he said, you'll get through. And MacArthur said, and back. So MacArthur, and when he finally made this pretty incredible journey, actually, to Mindanao by PT boat, because there were no submarines. He even told a priest there. He said, if the Jap doesn't take Mindanao by April, all he's going to receive are bullets. So MacArthur genuinely believed that he was going to lead this very quick relief of the Philippines. And as it turned out not to be the case, when he landed in the Philippines, or in Australia, and he made his famous statement in Adelaide, I shall return, he realized that he had actually left more troops on the Philippines than he had in Australia. And Australians were worried about, they were getting ready to give up the Brisbane. Like they were worried about that. So, and he basically just turned to one of his guys and said, God help us. And so that was really it. So once this happened, this is the Bataan Death March, obviously. This is the Americans then surrendering in Corregidor. So this is basically the close of the first phase of the war, right? But it's interesting, if you notice the date, May 6, 1942, that's right around the time the Battle of the Coral Sea is being fought. So these guys held out all the way to May from July, whereas the British surrendered, in February. And what's interesting is that the tide is already starting. It's not turning, but it's, like I call it in the book, a stopping point. It's not a turning point. Right? What would Churchill say? One of my favorite lines from him is about Al Alamein, the famous line, right? He said, it's not the end, even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. But still one of my favorite quotes. So these poor guys, and what's happening too is Americans are hearing about the Bataan Death March, and they're hearing about the execution of prisoners, and they're just hating the Japanese even more and more and more. So the hatred between these two adversaries is very, very intense at this point. And the Japanese obviously didn't respect these guys. They thought they should have fought to the death the way they would have. So it was just a clash of cultures that were oil and water. And then you throw these guys, a bunch of 18, 19-year-olds grown up in this mentality with guns on these little islands where none of them can escape. And it's like Thunderdome, right? So anyway, so this is what we were talking about before, where MacArthur was thinking that Europe had abandoned Asia, or that the Americans had abandoned Asia for Europe. Actually, they didn't, but they had no way to get the supplies to him. And so that's why there was one convoy, as you know, there was the Pensacola convoy that was supposed to go to the Philippines, but once the war started, it was diverted to Brisbane. And MacArthur thought then they'd ship it to him, but they never did, right? So when he comes out, MacArthur becomes pretty much the more interesting character in the book going forward, because he is driven to come back to the Philippines. That is he is obsessed with getting back to his men. And it's interesting because, he got the name Dugout Doug because he never left Corregidor really to go see these guys. And I think the reason, first of all, I don't think it's an unjust epithet. I think they needed to see their commander. I just think he couldn't look them in the eye, because I think once he realized that there was no hope, after he had been promising them that they're coming, I think he was quite frankly ashamed that he had been duped, and he didn't want to do that. And the only reason he came out, again, he was prepared to die on the Philippines. People don't understand this, but he had a very medieval mentality, and he was prepared to die with his wife and child on the Philippines.
Yeah.
He tried to send Jean MacArthur out, and she told Quezon's wife, she said, I go where, we drink from the same cup. I'm not leaving him. And they asked MacArthur, well, what about your little boy? He goes, he's a soldier's son. So he truly expected to go down because he was a very medieval guy in his mindset. So here we go. We got the famous Battle of the Coral Sea. This is a great photograph of Lexington being sunk. And then you got the Battle of Midway. I mean, I don't need to. We can talk about these if you like. I'm sure a lot of the people watching this know about this. It's interesting because it's first time when we stopped them from trying to land on Port Moresby, which then created the overland Kokoda attack. And then you've got Midway when we finally achieved parity, right? And this photograph is always kind of tragic because it's the torpedo squadron that left off the Enterprise, and only about torpedo. I think only 4 of them came back. And if this had been the Hornet, none of them would have come back, right? So anyway, so this is it wasn't a miracle, as everybody knows, right? I think, in fact, if you look at the beginning of the battle, we really had the same number of flight decks. Most people don't understand.
Yeah.
Right, because if you look about it, we had 3 carriers in Midway, and they had 4 carriers, and they had another one going up to the Aleutians. So it was a very, very important battle, though. It got us to parity at a very early time. So you think about it, so within 6 months, we've already basically stopped this. We've stopped this nonsense has gone on far enough, right? And so I think that speaks to the fact that you couldn't have done that if you hadn't put considerable resources into the Pacific, which belies the Europe first myth.
Yeah.
I think, tell me if you think so.
No, I agree. And I think the World War II community is gradually kind of moving away from the idea of the USA being the underdog at Midway and the Japanese being hugely numerically superior. It was a much fairer fight. And and as you said, Shattered Sword, John and Anthony's book has done huge strides to kind of change that. And I'm no MacArthur fan, but going back to your comments about MacArthur, you make some good points about it. I mean, I don't like MacArthur, but I can't deny he was committed to the Philippines. He absolutely he loved the place. He felt that he was, as Filipino as anybody else. He absolutely saw it as part of the USA, whereas a lot of people in the USA, as you made it clear earlier, if they even thought about the Philippines at all, they thought of it as very much as being foreign when it really wasn't. So MacArthur.
When we talk about when we talk about U.S. troops in the Philippines fighting in Bataan, we're talking about Americans and Filipinos.
Yes.
We're not just talking about American troops. In fact, there were more Filipinos in the Bataan Death March, and they lost more people in the Bataan Death March than the Americans did. And it's just amazing to me that a lot of people don't know that. And so, again, I guess the broader purpose of the book is to kind of do in a less deep dive way, kind of dispel some of the myths. And I don't go I don't say, oh, people think this and they're wrong, but I just kind of tell the story the way it is. Midway was a lot of luck. First of all, the break in the Japanese code, as you know, was key, and that wasn't luck. That was skill. That was and some good intuition on the part of Rochefort and the part of Leighton, right? To know that when the guy said that for Leighton with Rochefort with his photographic memory could remember. When they were talking about AF, he was like, a plane flew by AF in March. And so he goes through the files and he goes, oh, here it is. He does the circle. He goes, it had to be Midway. It was the only landmass that was around there they could have been talking about. And then they did that famous ruse where they did the saltwater desalinization and they played. So that wasn't luck. That was skill. And then you had an excellent commander in the form of Spruance, even though he wasn't even a trained carrier commander. He understood tactics. He wasn't a flyer. He knew, he made the right decision. He had Nimitz making the right decisions, trusting his intelligence, even though Kondo's force had been spotted first, and the guy even reported main body, right, the PBY. And then you had the Japanese make some serious mistakes, and they also had some, there's one myth. I think a lot of people's idea of the Battle of Midway came from the movie Midway, the 1970s with Charlton Heston, and so first of all they think that Scout Number 4 from Tone was the reason but it was really a different scout that, and I confirmed this with John actually before I put it in the book, that really overflew where the Americans, it's from Chikuma, that overflew where the Americans should have been, and for whatever reason they just didn't see it. So so their Nagumo's pro forma search was just didn't provide the results. So that was lucky. The timing of finally spotting this, of course, caught them in between. They're being attacked by planes from Midway, so they're like, okay, we haven't taken Midway out, right? Tominaga said we need a second strike, and then all of a sudden, you've got this carrier out there. So what do you do? So Nagumo's thrown, so the timing couldn't have been worse, right? And that's just luck. And then of course you've got the Nautilus, right, duking it out with Arashi, right, the submarine, and that held the Arashi back until the Kido Butai, sailed away. So Arashi is going at flank speed to get back to. And that's when McCluskey sees him when he's about to turn around because he's running out of the gas. And it just so happened that McCluskey was a fighter pilot, so he had that aggressive, nature. And it just, the tumblers just clicked, and they got very lucky. And then that delay, as you know, allowed them to meet one side of the Kido Butai just as Leslie's crew was coming in from Yorktown on the other. So it was a really, it was luck in the sense that we had better luck, but we set it up so that the luck was there, so that we could take advantage of it. And it was, it was a battle of parity. Yeah, the Devastator wasn't nearly as good of a torpedo bomber as the Kate and the Zero, but even like the Wildcat, you had Thatch at that point starting to devise tactics where I think the Wildcat's an underrated fighter personally. Especially, I'd take 2 Wildcats over a Zero personally. Just don't fight the Zero's battle. Just stay on the weave, and you'll be all right. So there's a couple of myths there, of course, and I think a lot of it came from Fuchida, right? He talked about crowded flight decks. If you read all you have to do is just read like Dusty Cleese's recollections, and he said here was the Zero taking off when Earl Gallagher's bomb landed. There were these Zeros loaded up. There were no Zeros to my knowledge, on Soryu. Maybe there was. You look at the photographs, right? You don't see any planes on here, right? So that's the Hiryu. So anyway, so there's a lot of interesting myths. So I think that's part of what people who don't, everything I'm telling, I'm sure most of your people have already heard 1,000 times. But remember, I wrote this for the crew that is friends with the people watching this who want to learn a little bit about the war. So now you've got, okay, what do we do? Okay, we've stopped the Japanese. All right, there's rumor they're building a seaplane base in Tulagi, so we better. So you better take that, and then later on they find out that this place called Guadalcanal also has an airfield, so they jam that into what they call Operation Pestilence. So now how are you going to go? How are you going to attack the Japanese? Well, MacArthur's like, well, look, we're going to the Philippines. We have to, right? Like you said, MacArthur was so obsessed with the Philippines that his headquarters was required to answer, "This is Bataan." He named his airplane Bataan. When the Japanese were flying into Okinawa to discuss surrender, their code signal was Bataan. So this guy was just obsessed with it, right? But he also felt, because these were, of all the people in the Pacific, these were Americans to him, and so of course they deserve the building. Well, of course, King's not going to let MacArthur, an army man, take over the entire Pacific War, right? I mean, if you're king, you're not going to. It's a naval war. Look at all this. So here's the compromise. Here's the famous compromise, right? Where they divided Guadalcanal, and they moved it over 1 degree so that it would stay in King's jurisdiction, which made sense. I mean, it was a marine operation. It was Navy operation. MacArthur was still building up his forces for defense of New Guinea, and so you've got this two-pronged advance against Japan, which actually, even though it was a compromise between the two services, turned out to be mutually supporting. It actually turned out to work quite well. And that's, of course, because you had MacArthur in the south and Nimitz in the north. The two best people, in my view, to command these. And I'll tell you why. You talk about MacArthur, right? And we'll get into that in a second. But I'll tell you why I have more nuanced views of him. So first of all, you've got the Solomons, right? And here's that famous Battle of Guadalcanal. And the one thing that I try to impress in the book is that Guadalcanal is remembered pretty much as an infantry battle in the jungle. Everybody remembers the 1st Marines, and there were Army there as well, and even a regiment of the 2nd Marines were there. By the way, if you want to read a great book about Guadalcanal, David Holland has a He has walking the battlefield. His name is David
Yep.
Holland. He's not John Holland. He's not the other Holland.
Yeah, no, Dave's been on World War II TV half a dozen times. Yeah,
Dave, okay, great. Well, he helped me a lot. Well, basically, he helped me a lot in my Guadalcanal because because a lot of these articles or a lot of these chapters were really articles that I'd written for Daily Wire. I know it's a political site, but they allow me to write a lot of military stuff on it. And so they actually contacted me and said, you've already written half of a book in the Pacific. You should just do the whole thing. But this was a big empty spot for me. I had not written about Guadalcanal. I knew about it because my dad was in the 1st Marine Division, but I didn't know much about it. And of course, and the one thing that I found is an astounding statistic. And I knew there were naval battles around there, but I didn't realize just how much naval combat was going on back and forth. I mean, from Savo Island, the worst open water defeat we've ever had. You had these, the first battle of Guadalcanal, in which an admiral and a captain, American, Callahan and get the admiral's name. They were killed. You had then the battleship, the Washington blasting the Hiroshima. I mean, you just had some wild battles, and by the end of the day, by the end of the campaign, for every infantryman killed on Guadalcanal, 3 sailors died protecting them. Mm. And I think that is something that needs to be really, really reckoned. And that kind of also shows you that the age of the carrier had come, but the surface fleets still had their place, right? Because Guadalcanal, when the Japanese tried to shell Henderson Field, it was Callahan who moved in his ships, his cruisers, and he gave his life doing it to stop them, right? And it was the Washington that stopped the Hiroshima. Yep. So it was really, to me, from a novelist standpoint, it's a wild story. It's a story that needs to be told. It's a edge of your seat story. I mean, when Nimitz had to relieve Gormley because he was very defeatist, and they put in Halsey, and Halsey sits down with Vandergrift and says, "Go back. I'll give you everything I've got." And suddenly you just have these incredible battles going back and forth, and so most Americans think, okay, Guadalcanal, that's the big battle that took place there. Nothing else happened, right, until Iwo Jima or whatever, right? Oh, no, actually, there were, I love this picture. Look at these guys trying to, how do you fight in this, right? And here's all the people. I just love these characters, right? You got Vandergrift, you got Gormley, you've got Turner, you've got Halsey, right? You've got, who is this, Hayakitake, you've got Colonel Ichiki, who attacked the Tenero, what they call the Tenero's Alligator Creek, which the Ilyeu, when he thought 900 men would just wipe out the Marines, and because in China he never fought against tanks, 37 millimeter guns, and Marines with machine guns and barbed wire behind them. He just fought, And you got Mikawa and this is Toyota. So, and here's the cool battles that were fought. Here's the Quincy caught in the lights of Savo Island, right? And here's the Washington. These are all maneuvers before the war, but this is what it would have looked like when he was firing on Hiroshima. I mean, look at this. This is stuff right out of Nelson, right? I mean, it really is, and I think it deserves more attention. So there's the Japanese coming in. There's Savo Island. The Japanese going into what they eventually called the Island of Death. Most of them died from disease. They didn't die from combat, and
I liked your title there about it being a grinding counteroffensive, because I think as a Brit, Guadalcanal is possibly the USA's first example of a long, drawn-out attritional war. Because you come into the Great War to the last year, you haven't experienced of the French and the British of slugging it out for fucking years.
Right.
A lot of your sort of Spanish-American wars, Teddy Roosevelt, Rough Riders, they're over pretty quickly. Right. At Midway was what it's a 24-hour battle, isn't it?
Right. So across these 2 days, right?
Yeah, Guadalcanal was your first kind of no. This is a long grudge, 2 heavyweights slugging it out over 20 rounds in a ring, and you learn how to do that kind of long war, that long, persistent, just dragging things out that takes you forward, and it's what got the British through Burma. It's what the got the British and the Commonwealth troops through Italy. Is that you can't always have a Hollywood ending where you've you've sorted out the battle in a day, and everyone goes home for, we say in Britain, tea and medals. You know,
right, and even the American Civil War, which was our bloodiest, you had these enormous battles: Gettysburg, Chickamauga, Antietam. Antietam was 12 hours. Gettysburg was 3 days. Chickamauga was 2 days, and there were huge casualties, right? 58,000 casualties in the Pennsylvania campaign. Antietam was 23,000 dead out of only 80,000 who actually participated in the battle. You had 20, not dead and wounded, but back then, of course, if you were shot in the arm on Tuesday, you died of gangrene 2 weeks later. There was no, there was very little recovery, or you might have been shattered. But yeah, with Guadalcanal, it was also the first time that we had to learn how to really coordinate, right? Because I kind of liken it to, in the way how everybody knows about the 300 Spartans, Thermopylae, and we know it's about 6,000, not just 300. They were SEAL Team 6, and then you had all the other Greeks with them. But very few people know about Artemisia, that Themistocles was fighting, which was the naval battle. At the same time, that's why Xerxes just couldn't go around Leonidas, because the Greek fleet under Themistocles was holding them at bay in an enormous naval battle, right? It was a stalemate, but that's all you need to do. And sort of the same thing is here, right? The Marines were only as good, and then Army were only as good as their supplies, right? And that's why Savile Island was really, this guy, where is he? This guy screwed up, I think, pretty badly. But what I try to do whenever I look at these battles, right? It's kind of like when you examine how you do a trade, right? You say, okay, what was I thinking at the time? We all know the verdict, right? But what was Mikawa, for example, thinking at the time? He was thinking that Fletcher was there with carriers, right? He didn't know that Fletcher had pulled his carriers out, so he didn't want to be under attack in the morning. So he blew apart 4 cruisers, but the transports survived. The transports were watching the battle, and they're like, Jesus, we're next. And then Mikawa just sailed away, right? So, so really, they had to learn how to not just fight on the ground, but how to keep these guys supplied. And really, the Pacific War was, your classic, for every man in the front line, there were 10 people in the supply line, behind them, keeping them fed and keeping them clothed and keeping them with ammunition. And, and for every guy on the New Jersey, there were 5 guys or 10 guys, whatever it would be, on these transport ships and these cargo ships. And it really was a war of logistics in a way that had not been seen before. And I think the Americans learned how to manage that a little bit better. And I think once industrialization really started to kick in, then all of a sudden you began to see who was going to control the sea would control the land. But yeah, this was a 6-month battle of attrition, and we didn't know if they were going to win. When Fletcher sailed off, which, by the way, when Fletcher said he was going to sail off, Turner said, if you do that, you're yellow. So that wasn't very, but he sailed away, and these guys are stuck, and they didn't know that that Turner had vowed to come back in a week. All they knew was that they were gone, and they're watching the Tokyo Express just bring in troops and supplies right in front of them. And they didn't know. It was not until the Cactus Air Force arrived, until the airplanes arrived, thanks to Nimitz, that they finally had a fighting chance, right? But the thing is that, all right, I'm an American. Okay, I heard about Guadalcanal, and that was it, right? No, there was a battle going on in New Guinea with Anzac troops at the start. Eventually, GIs joined them, and this campaign was brutal, and eventually, it was actually, so you talk about MacArthur, right? MacArthur made 3 major decisions, I think, in the war. And the first one was to defend Australia and New Guinea. Many Australians wanted to surrender the northern half of the continent. They thought the Japanese were just unstoppable. They were from Ceylon. They were all over the place, right? They'd taken Dutch East Indies. They'd just beaten the Navy at Java Sea again, and they called it the Brisbane Line, and MacArthur said, if the Japanese set foot on this continent, they're going to take it over. So he actually vowed to fight in New Guinea, to hold the line there at Port Moresby. And his staff was shocked because no one expected it. He said, well, because you don't expect it, they're not going to expect it either. And in fact, records show that Japanese were surprised that he established himself in Port Moresby. But the terrain in which they fought was some of the most unforgiving terrain you could possibly imagine. It was, the Owen Stanleys were 12,000 feet high at some point. They were the highest jungles in the world, some of the wettest jungles in the world, and and the Australians were able to hold these Japanese back enough so that once Guadalcanal became the major campaign, major seat of action, the Japanese told General Horiki to pull back. That we're not going to forget about Port Moresby. So Port Moresby was never taken, but these guys fighting in this jungle. I actually have if you have a second, I actually have a description that MacArthur sent 2 of his brigadiers to go into New Guinea and to scope it out and say, is this place a good place to fight or not? And they came back shaken. They were like, we thought the jungles in Bataan were bad. This is the worst we've ever seen. No one can even live here, let alone fight here. And so MacArthur was like, well, if we can't live there, neither can the Japanese. And so he, sent troops in, and he did. And fortunately for him, he had let's see here. He had a great general. Hang on here. Wait, hang on here. I thought I had this. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'll find it. But he had a very gifted air commander, General George Kenny of the 5th Air Force, who really was the guy who allowed MacArthur to feed to basically move his troops into New Guinea. What he did was he airlifted the entire he airlifted groups from Australia into Port Moresby, and they're like, well, what about heavy tanks or heavy trucks and stuff like that? And Kenny's like, we'll cut them in half with 17 torches, we'll shove them into C-47s, and we'll weld them back together on the other side. So he did amazing things, and so MacArthur was as good as his subordinates were, right? So the Australians, let's see here, where's the map? I gave you the wrong slideshow. It's all right. So they defend Port Moresby, stop the Japanese here. Obviously, they push the Japanese back over the Owen Stanleys. By the time they get to Buna and Gona, Horiki is dead. He's drowned in a river, right? So he's dead. The Japanese it became a rout because they cared more about racing towards their go-downs filled with rice and on the coast than they cared about fighting the Australians. And then the Americans, GIs are now there, and they've got to fight Buna, right? And they've got to go where the Japanese basically had, they had these, let's see here, here you go, where the Japanese had the perimeter was anchored by the sea on both sides, and these Americans who never fought before had to push their way through Buna. And Buna became, for the infantrymen, and Buna and Gona and Santa Ana became 3 times bloodier than Guadalcanal. But Americans don't know. But this is actually an interesting quote from Colonel White, who was there. He said, keep in mind, this was the first American offensive. Nobody was trained. Nobody had been bloodied in combat. The enemy had never lost a battle. They were excellent soldiers of the highest order. They had dug in with the sea anchoring each flank, and our job was to attack through the perimeter, right? And he said what they didn't know is the Japanese had built these bunkers, and he just describes the bunkers. And finally, it wasn't until Australian tanks came in that they were able to do it. So it was a bloody, horrible battle, and it was another battle which MacArthur never visited the front, which was, I think he stayed back at Port Moresby poring over his maps. And yeah, his arrows were moving north as opposed to south for once, but they weren't, or they were pointed, but they weren't moving, right? At one point, he sent Thomas Blamey an order that said Buna will be taken at dawn, and Blamey was like, "What are you talking about?" Right? That's like Nimitz sending Vandergrift a note that says Guadalcanal will be captured tomorrow. Japanese, you will destroy the Japanese. It was completely unrealistic. So I don't know what MacArthur was doing there. I don't know why he was, and he finally got Eichelberger in there, who was, I think, should be as famous as Patton. And Eichelberger Eichelberger broke the stalemate, and he finally got it. So here's where I call MacArthur's the first part of the war. He botched it in many ways, right? But then he certainly redeemed himself, and he did so with this campaign, which I think is the most interesting campaign of the war, personally. Certainly the Pacific, right? If you take a look, also what most people don't know is the Australians won the first time the Japanese had ever been pushed back was by Australians in the Battle of Milne Bay, which doesn't sound very exotic, Milne Bay, right? As opposed to, I don't know, Kasserine or something like that. So So MacArthur basically discovered, he looks around, and once he gets control of the Bismarck Sea, he says, okay, we can go up, we can go this entire coastline. It's longer than from Boston to Florida or wherever it is. And we did still have limited resources, although it wasn't as limited as he wanted people to believe, right? It's always more fun to win with inferior forces, makes you look better, right? So he then makes his second, and by now what they're pushing towards is the basic Rabaul, right? This is really the key. Halsey's coming up the Solomons, MacArthur's coming up the tail of New Guinea, and they're both going to try and converge on Rabaul. It's going to be a great big battle. 100,000 Japanese there, 4 airfields. It's got its massive depot at Aviation on New Ireland. I mean, this is the Japanese Gibraltar along with Truk, right? And MacArthur does something pretty incredible, I think, but it's also not very well known. He looks at the admiralties. He goes, you know what? Let's take Manus and Los Negros instead, and we can make the Bismarck. We can basically keep the Cobra. We can use this as the lid to the jar and keep the Cobra in Rabaul. Let's not take them. And interestingly, I had thought that was and even Manchester, who's sort of MacArthur file, thought that the bypassing of Rabaul was not his idea. But actually, some of the research I've done shows that it kind of was, and that he sent Sutherland to the Joint Chiefs in Washington, and they approved of it. I don't think Manchester did his research enough on that, but he actually makes a bunch of mistakes. But I'll leave that aside. And so, you have landings at ROA, right, to get onto New Britain, and the Japanese think, okay, here they come, right? So they send all their troops here, but that's just a diversion. Day after Christmas, MacArthur puts the 1st Marine Division at Cape Gloucester, right, under Kruger. And the Japanese are caught between 2 pincers. They retreat, and then pretty soon, before you know it, at Talasea, halfway up the island. And now all of a sudden, the guys in Rabaul are like, okay, the battle's coming to us, boys. Let's get the don your 1,000-stitch belts. Toast to the Emperor. We're going to take them all with it. We're going to kill 10,000, 20,000 Americans and Australians. And they never come. And they never came because MacArthur looks at the admiralties in Los Negros and goes, our planes have a lot more range than they did at the beginning of the war. We've got long-range P-38s. We've got 4-engine B-24s and B-17s. The P-38s can carry drop tanks. And here's what we'll do: we'll just take the admiralties instead. The problem is that intelligence had told that there were some 10,000 Japanese troops in the admiralties, and MacArthur didn't believe it because he thought, again, if I'm thinking, because his whole staff is like, you can't do that. And so MacArthur's like, well, the fact that you don't want me to do it is probably why it's a good idea. And sure enough, he landed on Los Negros, and the Japanese resistance was pretty ineffectual. There were about 2,000 troops on it. And he landed the first day, and one of his generals said, we're damn lucky we didn't get run off the island. So all of a sudden now he's got this air base here, and the Japanese underestimate how quickly the Americans now were building air bases. Like, we're starting to perfect, you were talking about how the Americans had to learn how to do this attrition warfare, right?
Yeah.
A big part of that is capturing a ground, burning out the kunai grass, plowing it out, putting your airfields on there. Next thing you know, you got a bunch of P-38s and some Corsairs or whatever, it's Marines, and all of a sudden you got yourself an air base, right? And MacArthur said the victory depends on advancing the bomber line. So now all of a sudden he doesn't need Rabaul, right? So Japanese, so these guys basically just rot till the end of the war. So I say in the book, Rabaul was the most important battle never fought. Over 100,000 Japanese.
Yeah.
When they had to surrender, the commander said it went from being a base to a prison. And by 1944, they weren't even raiding them anymore. I mean, it was just like they were just sitting there. They said they cared more about, raising potatoes than right. So anyway,
Rabaul is the Norway of the Pacific, or Norway is the Rabaul of the ETO. All those hundreds of thousands of troops sitting there, but nothing ever happened.
That's a very good analogy. Again, I never thought of that. That's an excellent analogy. So now the Japanese are like, all right, well, look, they're not going to, Wewak is our next base. They're going to have to land here. All right, let's bring all of our troops up from Hollandia to Wewak, and this is where they're going to hit next. Well, MacArthur goes, all right, here's what we're actually going to do. This is his second. So his second decision was landing on Los Negros with the admiralties. His third great decision was to do a 400-mile leap, 200 miles behind enemy lines to Hollandia, because MacArthur had understood that he was a general from the First World War. He saw the trench warfare. He saw what these wedged armies in the Western Front looked like together. And he's like, I'm never going to do that again, even though it's kind of ironic because he sort of did that at Buna, but which he would never admit, by the way. In fact, he warned Eichelberger subtly, never tell people I wasn't at Buna, right? And there was actually a photograph that said MacArthur on the front at Buna, but it had like a Packard in the corner. And Eichelberger said there were no Packards on the Kokoda Trail, right? So he was his own worst enemy. So instead he lands at Hollandia, and he lands at Aitape, right, which just has 200 troops. The Japanese are at Wewak. And so what they found in Hollandia was a very well-upholstered rear area, and the Japanese were there waiting to hear about the great battle at Wewak. And suddenly, destroying the Americans, suddenly the Americans are on their doorstep. And so the next couple of months, the Japanese had to hack their way to this. Aitape kept his left flank, and then his eastern flank. And by the time they got to Hollandia, one guy said, I don't want to say they looked like they came off of a cross, but they looked like they come from a deep hole in the ground. And so after that, he just kept hitting them where they ain't. It's as Bill Dunn, one of the journalists, said. He said it was a classic way that he said we dropped a few bombs on Wewak, but we never invaded it. He said it was a great way MacArthur liked to fight a war. So the reason I like MacArthur is he was bombastic. He was paranoid. He could be very petty. I thought his treatment of Wainwright after they surrendered Bataan was terrible. Right? Yep. He got a Medal of Honor for escaping Bataan, but Wainwright did. He nixed Wainwright's Medal of Honor for holding it as long as he did. Right. So yeah, if you want to dislike MacArthur the person, and plus he took $500,000 out of the Philippines on his way out. Right. So I mean, you can hate him for that, but if you look at his campaign, I mean, at some point he was capturing 1 mile for every casualty he was taking, and by the end of it, for more or less for every casualty he took, he inflicted 10 on the Japanese. And it's very safe to say that the McGuiney campaign was one of the most economical, even with Buna, was one of the most economical uses of lives in the taking of territory and the either destruction of or the bypassing and neutralizing of an enemy force. I mean, if you take a look, right, he's in Port Moresby, September 42. By July 44, he's in Sansapor. This is the second largest island in the world, right? That's an enormous landmass. So that's kind of why I like him, right? But now he's looking at the Philippines, right? And he's like, okay. Meanwhile, as you know, Nimitz, my other favorite character, is doing the same thing, and we're learning the hard way how to do an amphibious landing, right? And other than Tulagi, which was not a fortress, right? Dave Holland made sure that I knew that Tulagi was the first time Americans attacked a defended beach, not Tarawa. But we learned a lot at Tarawa. We learned how to, we had to take the Gilberts. And I always tell people, it's amazing that in a battlefield half the size of Central Park, some 5,000 men were shot down. Yeah. And we got 1,000. Japanese were basically wiped out. They took, I think, like 16 Japanese prisoners and a bunch of Korean laborers, and for a 3-day battle. But it's got my favorite communique from the war, where Colonel Shoup on day 2 sends, because they were thinking about pulling the Marines out, right? Because I can get into detail, but all the mistakes, the short, the shallow reef, and they use old charts and all that. David Shoup said famously, casualties many. He said, what was? Oh God, he said. Casualties many, percentage dead unknown, combat efficiency, we are winning. So I love that quote. So,
by the way, Brad, we're nearly 2 hours in, and we're only half.
Oh, are we? Oh, God, I'm so sorry. Okay,
no, hang on. I think what we're going to have to do is break this into 2 presentations. We'll bring you back to do the rest of it. So. No, it's brilliant stuff. Just that it's going to be too much for one show. So
wow. Well, you know what? That kind of tells this is what I faced when trying to write about the war. But
yeah,
I didn't want this to be about battles you guys have already talked about and about. But I did want to get more into the geopolitical side of it, so we can do that in the next one if you want.
Yeah, let's do it next one. Just kind of have 5 minutes to kind of conclude what you've been saying for this first part, and then we'll reschedule.
Right. So basically, right.
I don't want to touch what you're saying because it's good.
So the Central Pacific goes through these incredible battles of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The Marianas Turkey Shoot destroys Ozawa's fleet. And even though the attack on the carriers didn't do what Mitchell had hoped. But anyway, so really what it does is it gets you to this conference in Hawaii in July 1944, where they decide, okay, where are we going to go from here? Because now the 2 pincers have merged. Now you've got King who wants to go to Thailand, who wants to go to Formosa. You've got MacArthur who wants to go to the Philippines. You sit down with Leahy and with Roosevelt in Hawaii, and they each make their case, and it's fascinating. So I didn't realize that 2 hours had gone already.
No, it's been good, and people are just saying they can even be a part 3 if necessary. It's just
I hope people are enjoying it. I hope I'm not.
Yeah, they are.
It's just because
I know at the end of your presentation you've got all the stuff about the geopolitical situation, what's happening post-war. I don't want to skimp on that. So I think if we carry on, we'll be here for over 3 hours. Well, 4 hours. So we'll break now, and then we'll schedule a part 2, and we'll carry on because it's great.
Great, sounds good to me. Well, I mean, I love this stuff, as you can tell. So
yeah, definitely. And there have been a couple of points. Someone earlier on said that the Brisbane quote, the MacArthur thing, that there's some questions about whether or not that actually happened. So I'll encourage that person to reach out to you. It's great to have these discussions while you're doing the research, because there are people there with some knowledge out there who may be able to expand on things. We've got Aussies and stuff watching who may give us perspective. But yeah, Brad, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. But we'll, as Fraser just said, they definitely need a second program. Thanks, Brad. So I'll email you, Brad, and we'll set up a part 2, and we'll do that, because I don't want to cut this short. Well, I want to cut it short in the sense of into 2 parts.
But there's a good place. There's a good place to cut, because your audience knows about the Central Pacific. They know about Saipan. They know all this stuff. So I really want to get to, again, because of the geopolitical side of it, what went down in Hawaii, how they ended up deciding on the Philippines, and what happened afterwards, and how that impacted. So yeah, there's actually not a bad stopping point, if you will.
Brilliant. Well, folks, you know what to do. Check out Brad's website. Check out the book link, because it's already there on Amazon in the US. And then we're back with more stuff tomorrow. And again, thanks everybody who didn't see yesterday's show. We did hit that 100,000 subscriber mark at the weekend, which is fantastic. So thanks everybody for that. So buy my guest books, read their blogs, go to their websites, and make sure you can continue to support World War II TV. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, viewers. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers. Bye.
Good.